On August 21, 1966, Brazilian police climbed the forested Witten Hill in the suburbs of Niterói and discovered something that has since haunted criminologists, ufologists, and anyone who has ever heard this story. 2 dead bodies, neatly arranged, well-dressed, with their faces covered by lead plates. The lead wasn't lying on their faces. The lead was part of their faces, molten metal, pressed into the skin, fused with it as if there were no boundary between the person and the mask. The official conclusion stated, cause of death, suffocation. Unofficially, Dr. Astor Pereira de Melo, who performed the autopsy, never spoke publicly about this case again, not once, for the rest of his life. Campos dos Goitacazes is not the kind of place tourists visit. The town, nearly 300 kilometers north of Rio de Janeiro, stretches along sugar plantations and dusty roads where trucks carrying sugarcane crawl slowly. Nothing happens quickly here. Life here follows a schedule that hasn't changed in decades. Morning, work, lunch, more work, dinner, sleep, and so on in a never-ending cycle. Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz were the very flesh and blood of this city. Both grew up here, both stayed here, both found work here as technicians at a local television studio, a small provincial station that broadcasts news, soap operas, and soccer to hundreds of thousands of viewers in northern Rio de Janeiro. Miguel Viana was 34 years old, short, stocky, with a dark mustache and a habit of squinting in the light. Neighbors said you could always recognize him by that squint, even from a distance. Married, 2 children. He went to church on Sundays, though according to his wife Rosa, he had started going less often in the last couple of years. He loved fixing things, not just equipment at work, but anything that broke at home: locks, faucets, children's toys. Neighbor Joaquim Carvalho recalled, Miguel could fix anything. You'd come to him with any broken item, he'd look at it, think, and an hour later it would be working. He was neat, meticulous. He didn't drink excessively. Manuel Pereira da Cruz was 2 years younger, 32. Slender, with quick hands and a restless nature, also married. He worked alongside Miguel. They sat in neighboring offices, had lunch together, and went home from work together. Their neighbors called them inseparable, not because they were alike, but because they complemented each other. Miguel thought slowly and thoroughly. Manuel, quickly and impulsively. Both were experts in radio electronics. Both could handle oscilloscopes, transformers, and soldering irons as effortlessly as others handle a fork and spoon. But there was another side to them, one that people in town preferred not to speak of aloud, but to whisper about. In the 1960s, when the Soviet satellite was already circling the Earth and the Americans were about to reach the moon, many in Brazil, especially those involved with technology and radio waves, began asking questions that would have seemed crazy just 10 years earlier. Miguel and Manuel had been asking them for a long time. They read everything they could get their hands on: pamphlets about flying saucers, reprints of American magazines on alien contact, Portuguese translations of books on spiritualism. They attended meetings of a small group that their neighbors called mystics. People there discussed the possibility of communication with other worlds, talked about signals that supposedly come from nowhere, and about how the human mind is capable of much more than is commonly believed. Their wives knew about this hobby. They reacted differently. Rosa Viana, with irritated resignation, realizing that it was better for her husband to read strange books than to drink beer on the street. Maria de Cruz, with anxiety. She later said that Manuel had changed in recent months. He'd become distracted. He often went out somewhere in the evenings without explaining where. Sometimes he would get up at night and write something by the light of a small lamp. When she asked him about it, he would smile and say he would explain everything soon. The morning of August 16, 1966, was just like hundreds of other August mornings in Campos dos Goitacazes. Humid, stifling, with the heavy scent of cut reeds carried by the wind from the fields. Miguel had breakfast, ruffled the children's hair, grabbed his work bag, and left the house around 7:30. A neighbor saw him walking down the street, his usual self, calm, wearing a light-colored shirt, nothing out of the ordinary. But that same day, or perhaps a few days earlier, the exact time could not be determined, Manuel stopped by to see his niece, Teresa. He stopped by for a few minutes, for no particular reason, just like that. They talked about something trivial, the weather, relatives. As he was leaving, Manuel paused in the doorway and said something to her that Teresa remembered word for word. "When I come back, I'll tell you whether miracles happen in this world and whether it's worth believing in spiritualism." Teresa smiled. She decided it was just another one of her uncle's quirks. She didn't think much of it. Only later, much later, when she recalled that moment at the door, Manuel's stooped figure against the bright courtyard light, did she realize that he was saying goodbye. That he knew where he was going, and perhaps he knew there was no turning back. Early in the morning on August 17th, Miguel told his wife that he and Manuel were going to Sao Paulo for radio parts. Business as usual, a routine trip. Rosa helped pack their things. Nothing extra. A small bag, a change of clothes, money. Manuel told Maria almost the same thing. He only added that he intended to look at some used cars while he was there. He might buy one. To do this, he took all the family's savings from home. 2,300,000 cruzeros, which amounted to about $996 at the exchange rate at the time. A lot of money for a provincial technician. Money that had probably been saved up over several years. Maria walked him to the gate. He waved his hand without looking back. She watched him go until he disappeared around the corner. She never saw him again. The bus from Campos dos Goitacazes to Niterói took about 5 hours. Miguel and Manuel arrived in Niterói in the afternoon of August 17th, not in Sao Paulo, where according to them they were headed, but specifically in Niterói, a small port city across from Rio de Janeiro, separated from the capital by Guanabara Bay. At that time, there was no large bridge there yet, only ferries slowly creeping across the gray water. In the city, they moved methodically and quickly. The first store, radio parts, they bought some equipment. The receipt has been preserved. The second store, 2 yellow standard raincoats made of rubberized fabric. The third stop, a bar on the corner. They bought a bottle of mineral water but didn't take the receipt for the bottle deposit. The saleswoman would later explain to the police that this very detail was what made her remember these 2 men. In the 1960s in Brazil, everyone always returned bottles because they got money back for them, even if it was just a small amount. Not taking the receipt meant voluntarily throwing money away. Either these 2 were very rich, or they simply didn't care, because they knew there was no one to return the bottle to, and nowhere to return it. The saleswoman also remembered that both of them kept glancing at their watches. Not anxiously, not nervously, but rather intently, like people who have a schedule and are trying to stick to it. When asked if they needed help, one of them, the older one, briefly shook his head and placed the coins on the counter. Around 2:30, they walked to the outskirts of Niterói, where the city buildings thinned out and the forested hills began. One of these hills was called Viten. Not particularly high, not particularly famous, just one of the many mounds around Niterói. At its foot, an elderly watchman, a retiree whom the neighbors had hired to look after a small garden plot, was dozing in a folding chair. The watchman saw a black pickup truck pull up to the foot of the hill. He didn't remember the make, but said only that the vehicle was large, clean, and clearly not local. 2 men carrying bags got out of it. Then a third man got out from behind the wheel. Fair-haired, fair-skinned, tall. Like someone from the northern countries, the watchman described him. Not Brazilian. Most likely not South American at all. The 3 stood by the car for a few seconds. They didn't speak, or spoke quietly. Then the fair-haired man raised his hand in a farewell gesture, got back into the pickup, and drove away. Miguel and Manuel, carrying their bags, began to climb the path up the hill. No one ever saw them alive again. The bird catcher, Paulo Cordeiro dos Santos, went to Viton Hill almost every morning. He set snares in the bushes along the lower edge of the forest and checked them before dawn, while the birds had not yet scattered. On August 18th, he climbed the hill earlier than usual, around 5 o'clock. The forest was dark and damp, smelling of rotting leaves and wet clay after the night's rain. He found them about 200 meters from the summit. At first, he didn't realize what he was seeing. 2 dark silhouettes among the trees, positioned too neatly for people who had fallen there by accident. He moved closer. Two men lay on their backs, stretched out neatly on a bed of cut palm leaves. Well-dressed, suit pants, shirts. Their raincoats were folded nearby. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs of a fall. Everything was very quiet, very orderly, very strange. Paolo stepped even closer and stopped, because he saw their faces. Or rather, he saw what was in place of their faces. On each of the men lay masks carved from sheet lead. But lay, that's not the right word. They weren't lying there. They were there. The gray metal, covered with sparse bubbles of congealed scale, fit tightly against the skin. No, more tightly than just fitting. Where there should have been a boundary between the metal and the face, there was nothing. The skin merged into the lead. The lead merged into the skin, as if someone had melted both at the same time and let them solidify together. Paolo later said that at first he thought the men were simply sleeping, dead drunk, as happens after a serious binge. There was something about their postures that was too relaxed, too calm for death. But the smell of decay was already wafting through the damp air. And the masks. Lead masks on the dead faces, fused into the flesh. He ran down the hill, found police patrolman Antonio Guerra on the street, and told him everything. Guerra listened. It started to rain, a heavy, tropical downpour. It was the year 1966. A military dictatorship had ruled Brazil for 2 years. The coup of April 1964 had placed the military at the head of the country, and since then, police stations had been in a state of constant mobilization, hunting down communists, breaking up student gatherings, and compiling lists of unreliable individuals. Guerra looked at the wet road, at the bird catcher's frail figure, and thought about the report due the next morning. It contained names that needed to be checked, addresses that needed to be visited. Drunks on the hill. Guerra waved his hand. He said something to the effect that they'd sort it out tomorrow, and he didn't think about it again for 2 days. 2 days. For 2 days, under the August sun and tropical downpours, 2 bodies lay on the summit of Viton Hill, on cut palm fronds with metal fused into their faces. On August 20th, 18-year-old Jorge da Costa Alves came to Viton Hill to fly a kite. It was the young man's usual afternoon pastime. The hill caught the wind well. He climbed about 100 meters up the slope, looking for a spot, and then a path led him to a small clearing among the trees. He caught the scent from about 40 meters away, a thick, cloyingly sweet smell that occurs in only one situation, though the 18-year-old boy didn't know that yet. He pinched his nose with the hem of his shirt and kept going. That very eerie childhood curiosity that is stronger than fear and stronger than common sense. Later, he couldn't explain why he hadn't turned back. He just kept walking. What lay in the clearing had changed beyond recognition after 3 days under the tropical August sun. Swollen, darkened, no longer quite human. Jorge stopped 2 steps away. He fixed his gaze on the details. Later, during questioning, he described them with the methodical precision of a man who wants to be believed. 2 bodies on a bed of palm leaves. Nearby, an empty mineral water bottle, 2 white towels folded into a neat rectangle, black sunglasses, a small homemade cup twisted from aluminum foil, raincoats, unworn, spread out nearby. The knife used to cut the palm leaves for the bedding was nowhere to be found, but the faces were the main thing. Jorge took the last step and looked up at the faces. The lead plates covering them were not just masks. They had grown into them. At the edges, where the metal ended and the cheeks and forehead began, the boundary was uneven, bubbly, as happens when 2 materials fuse under intense heat. The skin around the masks had darkened, not from decay, something else, something different. It had been melted, like fabric around a cigarette burn, only on a larger scale, more terrifying. Through the eye slits, the masks had such slits, rough, uneven, clearly made by hand. Jorge peered inside and recoiled. He doubled over against the nearest bush. Then he stood there for a long time, holding onto the tree trunk. Then he walked down the slope without looking back, dragging the kite behind him through the grass. He reached the city by evening, It was pouring rain again. Once again, the police didn't come. They said, in the morning. On the morning of August 21st, a police car finally made its way up to the foot of Witten Hill. By that time, journalists, someone had called the local newspaper, had already beaten them there. And following the journalists came the onlookers. By the time the investigators reached the clearing, several dozen people had already been there. Everything around was trampled. Any possible traces, footprints, or evidence, destroyed. The bodies were identified quickly. Both had their driver's licenses on them. Miguel Jose Viana, 34 years old, from Campos dos Goitacazes. Manuel Pereira de Cruz, 32 years old, from the same city. The police in Campos dos Goitacazes were contacted immediately. That same day, the families received the bad news. 3 sheets of notebook paper were found in Miguel's pocket, soaked through but still legible. His brother Herval later recognized the handwriting and was surprised. Miguel always wrote neatly, but here were grammatical errors that were uncharacteristic of him, as if he had written in a hurry or in an altered state. On the first sheet were physical formulas that no one was ever able to fully decipher, and a list of radio parts. On the second, instructions written in a businesslike, emotionless tone. 16:30, be at the designated location. At 6:30 p.m., swallow the capsule, put on the metal masks for protection, and wait for the signal. On the third was a 4-day schedule for taking some capsules with dosages and times listed. The dead men had catastrophically little money. Manuel had less than $2. Miguel had about $68. Of the nearly $1,000 Manuel had left home with, less than a tenth remained. Where did the money go? No one knows. The masks. The investigators had to document what none of them could explain. Both autopsy reports noted the same thing. Lead plates, about 20 centimeters long and 15 wide, clearly cut from a single piece of lead pipe and shaped with a knife or chisel, were not simply lying on their faces. A distinctive rim was visible around the perimeter of each mask. Where the metal had come into contact with the skin of the forehead, cheeks, and nose, the facial tissue had been altered, hardened, partially pressed into the bone. In several places, the metal had literally grown into the pores of the skin, as if a temperature sufficient to soften lead, 327 degrees Celsius, had briefly risen beneath the mask. And at the same time, something had happened to the skin itself that prevented it from simply burning away, but caused it to fuse together. But it was precisely this that left forensic pathologist Asta Pereira de Melo in a state that his colleagues later called professional shock. Melo stood over the bodies, trying to reconcile what he saw with what he knew. Lead melts at 327 degrees. This is a physical fact that admits of no exceptions. Such a temperature ignites paper in a matter of seconds, melts plastic, and turns human hair to ash. But the hair on the heads of both victims was untouched. The black plastic frames of the sunglasses lying a few centimeters from the masks had not melted. Not a single one. 3 sheets of notebook paper in Miguel's pocket remained intact, soaked from the rain but not scorched. The palm leaves of the bedding extending directly beneath the bodies, right at their heads, were intact. The rubberized fabric of the raincoats nearby was intact. The heat that melted the lead masks did not touch anything around them. It was directed with surgical, terrifying precision, only at the metal, only at the masks, only at what was in contact with the faces of the 2 dead men. Melo wrote in the report what he wrote, and never said another word about the case. Not during interrogations, not to journalists, not to colleagues. Many years later, his daughter would recount that her father forbade any mention of the case at home, that he once said, "Some things are better left unknown." It was impossible to remove the masks, not under field conditions. The medical examiner had to cut them away, along with the necrotic tissue, which had already begun to decompose after 4 days in the heat. Later, in the laboratory of the Niterói morgue, technicians working with the samples spent several hours separating the flesh from the metal using chemical methods. When the procedure was finished and the masks had been washed, one of the lab technicians, a young man named Silvio Neves, asked to be transferred to another department. He refused to explain why. He left and never returned. On the inside of each mask, where a human face once was, the pressure of the molten metal against the skin and the skin against the metal had preserved its shape. The fine lines of the eyebrows, the hollow of the bridge of the nose, the curve of the cheekbones. 2 human faces in lead. The imprint of 2 dead men in metal, which fused with them on the hilltop in August of '66. Not a death mask, as was done with great men, casting their features in plaster after death. Something quite the opposite. Metal entered living faces while the people were still, perhaps, breathing, and froze there forever. The autopsy revealed no wounds, no bruises, no bite marks, and no injection marks. A full toxicology report was never conducted. The refrigerators at the Niteroi morgue were all occupied that day. An assassination attempt had taken place in the city against the local politician, and the criminal investigation unit was occupied with another case. Miguel and Manuel's bodies were never placed in the refrigerator in time. The autopsies were performed 5 or more days after death, in conditions of tropical heat and humidity. By that time, most of the evidence had been destroyed by the passage of time. The official conclusion? Given the condition of the bodies, it is impossible to determine the cause of death. Investigator Jose Venancio Betancourt was a seasoned man, not a young enthusiast, not a romantic, but a weary police officer with 20 years of service behind him, 10 of which he had spent in Niteroi. He didn't believe in flying saucers. He didn't believe in the supernatural. He believed in motive, opportunity, and alibi. His first move was to go to Campos dos Goitacazes and talk to the victims' neighbors. The picture that emerged was this. Both men were connected to a small group of local mystics, semi-legal, unregistered, and lacking a formal structure. People would gather at someone's house to discuss spiritualism, ufology, and signals from space. Nothing illegal. Neighbors had seen Miguel and Manuel working on something in the shed over the past few weeks, cutting and soldering. It later turned out that this was when they had made the lead masks. They cut them from a piece of lead pipe they had bought at a hardware store. Why? The neighbors didn't know. They didn't explain it themselves. On August 27th, the police arrested Elcio Correa Gomez, a civilian pilot who, according to available information, was the spiritual leader, or, at the very least, the mastermind behind the group. Betancourt suspected him of involvement, but Gomez had a rock-solid alibi. On the night of August 17th to 18th, he was flying a route that was recorded in the flight log and confirmed by ground services. He was released. He refused to talk about Miguel and Manuel. He only said that they were good people and that he didn't understand what had happened. He wouldn't look Betancourt in the eye. The murder theory didn't hold up. There was no reason to take people to the top of the hill, lay them neatly on palm leaves, and cover their faces with homemade masks. The suicide theory fell apart immediately. Both led traditional lives, were married, had children, and no one had noticed any signs of depression or despair. Betancourt paced his office, seething with anger. What could have killed 2 healthy men without a single scratch? Poison. That was the most logical explanation. But how could he prove it when those fools at the morgue had let the bodies rot in the heat? And because the refrigerators were full, they hadn't been able to conduct a proper toxicology test. No self-respecting court would accept a conclusion based on samples 5 days old from a tropical climate. From the very beginning, the investigation had been blinded in one eye, and Betancourt knew it. There was another question that wouldn't leave him alone. The very one concerning the missing items. Betancourt racked his brain over the selective nature of the theft. If ordinary looters from the nearby favelas had been there, why did they take nearly $1,000 from the pockets, but leave Miguel's expensive wristwatch untouched? The watch cost more than most people's daily wages in the area. If it was cult members or accomplices, why would they need a knife used for cutting palm leaves? The knife was just a knife. Cheap, a utility knife. Leaving the expensive watch and taking the knife isn't the logic of a looter. It's the logic of someone who knew exactly what to take, and knew exactly what to leave behind. Betancourt grew increasingly suspicious of Patrolman Guerra, the one who first learned about the bodies from the birdcatcher Paulo, but remained silent for 2 days. He remained silent while the bodies decomposed. He kept quiet while time destroyed any potential evidence. According to the investigator, It was during those 2 days that someone could have gone to the hill and taken everything that was not supposed to be found. It was not possible to prove this. Guerra continued to serve in the police force. On the evening of August 17, 1966, at the very moment Miguel and Manuel were climbing Beacon Hill with bags and a bottle of mineral water, Gracinda Barbosa Coutinho de Souza was driving on the outskirts of Niterói. She had 3 children with her. They were returning from visiting relatives, driving along the road through the hills. The windows were rolled down, and the air smelled of heated dust and the sea. Gracinda did not tell the police about this right away. She waited until the story about the bodies on Beacon Hill appeared in the newspapers. She waited a few days, and only then went to the police station. Because she was afraid they wouldn't believe her, because she herself didn't understand what she had seen. Above Beacon Hill, roughly in the direction where the bodies were later found, she saw a glowing object, egg-shaped, orange in color. It wasn't moving. It hung motionless about 150 meters above the hilltop. Around it was a ring, several rings, rotating in different directions, glowing in different colors, red, green, white. 3 beams of blue light extended downward from the bottom of the object toward the hilltop. Not diffused like a searchlight, but narrow and distinct, like laser pointers, only each one a meter thick or more. She stopped the car. She watched for about 2 or 3 minutes. The children watched too, silent, confused. Then the object, smoothly, without a sound, faded away. It simply ceased to exist. It didn't fly away. It didn't fade into the darkness. It simply vanished, like a lamp that's been turned off. In the weeks that followed, several more people contacted the police, having seen something similar over Beacon Hill that same evening or on the following nights. Their accounts did not match in every detail. Some spoke of a single object, others of several. Some described a blue light, others a red one. But the shape, location, and approximate time were consistent across all accounts. Another detail also came to light. On March 16, 1966, 5 months before Miguel and Manuel's deaths, several people observed a similar object over Niterói. The descriptions were the same: egg-shaped, glowing, with rings. The date, location, and shape. A 5-month difference. Bittencourt included Gracinda's testimony in the case file, and he did nothing with them because he didn't know what to do with them. It would have been convenient if the story had ended here. 2 provincial mystics, a strange death, several contradictory witnesses, case closed. But the story did not end. It unraveled like a ball of yarn in which every thread led somewhere from which there was no escape. It turned out that Miguel and Manuel were not the first. In 1962, 4 years before the events on Beacon Hill, a local TV repairman whom everyone called Hermes was found dead on the neighboring Cruzeiro Hill. He lived alone, kept to himself, but his neighbors knew of his eccentricities. Hermes believed that under certain conditions, the human brain was capable of receiving television and radio signals directly, without equipment. He took some kind of pills, the origin of which was unknown. He wrote something in notebooks that disappeared after his death. The case was closed as a suicide without an investigation. No toxicology report, no full autopsy. Just dead, lonely, strange, suicide. Bittencourt knew about this case. I wanted to review his files, only to discover that some of the documents were missing. Which ones exactly? The very ones that might have contained a description of the body and possible clues. Another lead pointed in a different direction. In 1964, 2 years before the deaths of Miguel and Manuel, 2 men were detained in Rio de Janeiro while attempting to smuggle an unusual cargo across the border. Several kilograms of sheet lead and sealed metal capsules, the contents of which were never officially disclosed. One of the detainees had a surname similar to one of the surnames among Pilot Gomez's associates. A connection? Maybe. Maybe not. Bittencourt tried to investigate and hit a dead end. The case had been transferred from customs to another agency, and the trail went cold. Capsules. Capsules again. Miguel's note read, 6:30 p.m., swallow capsule. On the 3rd page was a 4-day schedule for taking the capsules. What were these capsules? No one knows. As a reminder, no proper toxicology tests were ever conducted. The capsules were never found, not on the bodies, not at the scene, not in the victims' homes, not in the shed where they made the masks. Nowhere. In 1969, the case was officially closed. Cause of death? Undetermined. No one was found guilty. The case of the lead masks was archived, and the masks themselves, already cleaned in the lab, no longer bearing living flesh but retaining its imprint, were transferred to the Rio de Janeiro Police Museum. In a display case alongside other exhibits, murder weapons, forged documents, trophies from solved cases. Only this case had not been solved. According to former curator Claudio Mestri, museum staff initially displayed the masks vertically, like ordinary exhibits. Later, they began placing them horizontally, because in the vertical position, they looked as if someone were still wearing them. Because on the inside, where the pressure of the molten metal had preserved human features, the fine lines of the eyebrows, the hollow of the bridge of the nose, the curve of the cheekbones, one could make out faces. Two faces, Miguel's and Manuel's, pressed into the lead in a moment that lasted perhaps less than a second, but left a mark forever. They say that one of the museum employees wrote a report requesting that the masks be moved to storage, away from visitors. The report has not survived, or perhaps it was never found. Rosa Viana lived another 23 years after her husband's death. Until the end of her life, she refused to speak to journalists. Once, just once, she told her daughter, "He knew he wasn't going for the details. I could see it in his eyes." Nothing more. Maria de Cruz left Campos dos Goitacazes a year after her husband's death, along with her children, to another city, far from the neighbors and their questions. She didn't tell any of her acquaintances her new address. She simply vanished from that life, as if she'd dissolved into thin air. Her niece Teresa, to whom Manuel had promised to explain whether miracles really happen in this world, waited a long time for an answer. Then she realized that the answer already existed. She just didn't know what it was. Because the correct answer could have been either yes or no. Depending on what happened at the top of Witten Hill on August 18, 1966, at 6:30 in the evening. In 1980, the renowned Franco-American ufologist Jacques Vallée personally visited Niterói. Vallée is neither a charlatan nor a fanatic. A scientist with 2 doctorates, one of the developers of the first computerized star catalog at the Paris Observatory, and a consultant for the U.S. Air Force's Blue Book project. A man who, in his own words, tries to apply the same methodological standards to the study of anomalous phenomena as he does to any other scientific problem. He climbed Witten Hill. He surveyed the site. 14 years later, the ground in the clearing where the bodies were found still looked unusual. The grass grew sparsely, unevenly, in patches. The central part of the clearing, where the bodies had lain, was practically bare. The soil was compacted, darker than the surrounding area. Vallée took samples. Skeptics had a simple explanation. In 1966, the police and medical examiners, working with decomposing bodies in the tropical heat, had used formalin, pouring it onto the ground around the bodies to disinfect the site. Formalin kills vegetation for a long time. That's quite enough of an explanation. Vi listened to this explanation and asked, "How do you explain the compaction of the soil? Formalin doesn't compact the soil. Compaction of this nature occurs under intense pressure, mechanical or thermal." The police did not place anything heavy on the clearing. No equipment whatsoever, no vehicles. The clearing was not visible from the road, and there was no access road to it. According to Vallée, analysis of soil samples revealed traces of thermal impact extending several centimeters deep. Not superficial, deep, as if from brief exposure to a very high temperature from above. In the book Collisions, published in 1990, Vallée classified the case of the lead masks as a so-called fifth-kind contact, a category that included cases with physical traces of impact on humans or the environment, and he assigned it the highest plausibility rating. Not because he was convinced of the extraterrestrial nature of the events, but because, in his words, none of the proposed rational explanations accounted for the entire body of evidence at once. The entire body of evidence. Not a single one. In 1986, 20 years after the deaths of Miguel and Manuel, 2 bodies were found on Grumari Beach in Rio de Janeiro. Olavo Mena Barreto, 25 years old, a programmer. Wellington Barros Vanderlei, 24 years old, a courier. Both were lying on their backs in clean clothes with no signs of a struggle or violence. Nearby were 2 plastic cups, a bottle of mineral water, and a small glass vial with a pungent odor. Analysis revealed that the vial contained an organophosphate pesticide, a potent organic poison that affects the nervous system. There were no signs on the bodies that they had ingested this substance. The origin of the vial is unknown. The cause of death has not been officially determined. A connection to the 1966 case has not been officially established. There is not a word about this in the case files, but there are details that give pause for thought. 2 people, young, no signs of violence, neatly laid out on their backs, a bottle of mineral water nearby, clean clothes, and, most importantly, according to colleagues and relatives, both had been interested in experiments with receiving signals in recent months. One of them, a programmer named Olavo, left a draft text at work shortly before his death, which a colleague happened to read and could not forget afterward. The draft read, "Masks do not protect against radiation. Masks protect against what happens to the face at the moment of contact." What does that mean? No one knows. The draft disappeared from the programmer's desk on the same day the bodies were found. Who took it is unknown. August 1966, V10 Hill, 6:30 in the evening. One can try to reconstruct what happened, based on notes, the arrangement of objects, what is written in the reports, and what is intentionally or unintentionally left out of them. Miguel and Manuel climbed up to the clearing around 4:30 or earlier. They had time. They spread out the palm leaves, cutting them with a knife, carefully, to create something like a mat, 2 even rectangles. They laid white towels next to them. They set down a bottle of water. They placed a pair of black sunglasses. They crumpled a small cup out of foil, maybe for the capsules to wash them down with water, maybe for something else. At 6:30, according to the instructions in the note, they were supposed to take the capsules, put on the masks, wait for the signal. It was written clearly, like a standard operating procedure. No poetry, no doubts. Techies. They approached this as a technical task. There are instructions, there is equipment, there is a protocol. It must be carried out. They put on masks, homemade, crude, made from a cut-open lead pipe, with slits for the eyes. They lay down on a bed of palm leaves and waited for the signal. The signal came. Or maybe it didn't. But something happened. A few minutes later, or maybe an hour, time in this clearing, it seemed, flowed differently than down below in the city. An orange egg-shaped object with rings of blue and red light appeared above the hill. 3 beams struck the ground in the clearing, or the people in the clearing, or those lying in the clearing wearing lead masks staring at the sky through rough slits for their eyes. And then, at that very moment, something happened to the masks. What exactly? Physics offers only one answer. The masks melted. The lead softened at 327 degrees Celsius, under the influence of something that came from above, from outside, from the outside. The softened metal was pressed into their faces. The skin, for some reason that the medical examiner noted but could not explain, did not burn. It did not necrotize. The hair on their heads did not catch fire. The plastic of their glasses did not melt. The palm leaves beneath their heads did not smoke. Simply, the metal took their faces, as if the boundary between one and the other had ceased to exist for a brief moment, and only between the 2 of them, nothing else. How long did it last? A second, maybe less. Were they alive at that moment? The report provides no answer. The report states only that death occurred, cause undetermined, time undetermined. Then the object above the hill faded away. The 3 children in Gracinda Barbosa's car watched the vanished light fade away. The forest fell silent. The rain came later, already at night. 2 people lay in the clearing, neat, motionless, with lead on their faces, or more precisely, with faces that had turned to lead. The knife used to cut the palm leaves was gone. The money was gone. The capsules were gone. All that remained was what had been left behind intentionally, or what could not be taken. 2 dead men, masks that had become part of their faces, and 3 wet sheets of notebook paper in the pocket of what had once been Miguel José Viana. In 1997, Brazilian journalist Mauro Aguiar, who had been investigating the lead mask case for several years, interviewed an elderly man who wished to remain anonymous. He claimed that in 1966, he had worked at the Niterói Municipal Laboratory and had participated in the initial processing of evidence from the crime scene on Beckon Hill. 30 years later, he was ready to speak, partly because he was already old, and partly because, in his words, he didn't have much time left to remain silent. He told Aguiar the following: when tissue samples from the site of contact between lead and skin arrived at the laboratory, the very samples that, if stored properly, could have told pathologists a great deal, something strange happened to them. The samples began to degrade abnormally quickly, much faster than in similar cases, as if something had accelerated their degradation. The head of the lab, he mentioned his name, but Aguiar decided not to publish it, ordered the remains to be destroyed. He didn't explain why, just destroy them. Aguiar published this interview in a small magazine with a circulation of no more than a few thousand copies. A few months later, the magazine went out of business. The original recording of the interview, Aguiar had made it on a tape recorder, was, according to him, destroyed along with the tapes of other interviews during the editorial office's move. Only Aguiar himself knew the name of the anonymous source. He died in 2003. The name was lost with him. The lead masks are still kept at the Rio de Janeiro Police Museum. According to the latest information, they have been moved to storage and are not on display. The reason for the move is not specified in official documents.